Gaza, what does the future hold after another deadly conflict with Israel and its bombardment by Israeli forces? Hello, I'm Mike Walter sitting in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. The truce between Israel and Hamas is still holding after the recent 11-day conflict that included a punishing Israeli military assault on Gaza. The small strip of land that is densely populated and home to about 2 million Palestinians suffered severe damage and loss of life. Over 250 Palestinians were killed, including more than 60 children. Israel has defended its attack, saying it was responding to Hamas militants who fired rockets into Israel that killed 12 people there. Recovering from military assaults by Israel is not new to Gaza, as it again tries to cope from a devastating blow. We begin with this report from Gaza by CGTN correspondent Noor Harazin.
Nowadays, you can hardly walk around Gaza's neighborhoods without seeing the rubble of destroyed residential buildings, shops, and homes that were targeted in the latest Israeli-Hamas 11-day war. The Palestinian Ministry of Public Works and Housing reported that more than 2,000 housing units were completely destroyed, while around 15,000 units were partly destroyed. The report also indicated that more than 60 schools and health facilities were damaged. Sewage networks and underground water supplies were also severely affected as a result of heavy shelling and direct targeting. The ministry said in a statement that the reconstruction of the housing sector in Gaza needs at least $350 million.
Approximately 2,200 housing units are completely destroyed and not suitable for housing. Families needed to be accommodated in apartments and temporary shelters. We're working to speed up the reconstruction process by discussing appropriate mechanisms with donor countries to start this as soon as possible.
According to the Palestinian Ministry of Health, 253 Palestinians were killed in the latest tension, including 66 children, 38 women, and 17 elderly people, while more than 1,900 injuries were reported. Health officials in Gaza say that Israel targeted medical facilities and medical staff.
There is a very serious damage to health institutions, where more than 84 healthcare centers were targeted, including outpatient clinics and coronavirus patient centers, all because of the Israeli heavy shelling. The value of the damages to the health sector amounted to $4,200,000.
Meanwhile, the economic situation in Gaza looks dire. Despite donations, it may take many years to reconstruct and rebuild the destroyed local factories.
The violations the Palestinian people were subjected to by the Israeli occupation are war crimes and crimes against humanity. It totally destroyed the economy. The closure of the crossings and the destruction of infrastructure, industrial and agricultural facilities. This has left great effects on the human rights situation, represented in the high rates of poverty and unemployment.
The residents of Gaza are dealing with war's psychological impacts too.
Our children live in fear, and not only the kids. We, the grown-ups, are feeling the same. We fear for ourselves and our homes. We fear for everyone and everything around us. People are lying when saying that we are used to wars. Every time a new fear arises, wars change and get harder from year to year. We just want to live peacefully.
The international community is seeking to speed the start of reconstruction in Gaza, but Israel wants to link the process to the release of Israeli soldiers captured by Hamas in Gaza, in addition to guarantees to prevent armed factions from using reconstruction funds to strengthen their weapons, which complicates the reconstruction process and opens the door to possibilities of new rounds of conflict. Noor Harazin, CGTN, Gaza.
To take a deeper look at what life is like in Gaza and for perspective on why this conflict keeps repeating itself every few years, we now hear from our distinguished panel. Joining me from London is Abdel Bari Atwan. He was born in Gaza. He's the editor-in-chief of al-Youm, a news and opinion website. With us from Jerusalem is Mitchell Barak. He's an Israeli pollster and political analyst. With us, too, is Khalil Jahshan, He is a Palestinian-American political analyst and media commentator, and joining us as well, Dan Arbell. He's a 25-year veteran of the Israeli Foreign Service and is now scholar in residence at the Center for Israeli Studies at American University. I want to thank all the panelists for joining us. Mitchell, why don't I begin with you? You heard the strong criticism in Nur Harzin's report, one of the individuals describing the Israeli occupation as war crimes and crimes against humanity. What do you think when you hear those criticisms?
Well, I'm glad that you can keep this issue going, even, 2 weeks after a ceasefire. I mean, everyone else is moving on in the region, but you're continuing to go back and rehash this story and bring these very sad sob stories about people who were civilians who were killed. It's unfortunate that they live under the territory of a, they talk about the occupation, but they're really being occupied by Hamas, which is a terror organization, which calls for the destruction of Israel. Now, of course, the kids and the parents are fearful because they live in a system, in a place that has no rules. And to say that Israel targeted 84 medical facilities, the place that Israel should have bombed is the Shefa Hospital, because that's where the biggest stockpile of weapons is for the Hamas. Hamas cynically uses their own people. They don't care about civilians. They don't care about the children. They cynically use them as human shields. They hide weapons in schools and in hospitals, and then they indiscriminately fired 4,000 rockets on Israel. So the casualties that were inflicted after Israel, sought to destroy the terrorist infrastructure, the tunnels, the stockpile of weapons, was pretty minimal in what it could be. So it's nice to, keep bringing this story up. It's unfortunate. The people of Gaza deserve much better than a terror organization as its leader. There's 2 million people there. They're living in very, very bad humanitarian conditions. Fortunately, the world community is now giving money to rebuild. I just am hopeful that Hamas will change its tone and stop focusing on the destruction of Israel and start focusing on the construction of its own people, of its own facilities, of its own buildings, and start to provide those people with a better way of life. And it may just be a good opportunity now that there's a new government coming into Israel. But the ceasefire is going to hold as long as Hamas stops firing rockets on the Israeli civilian population. Give up the terror. It's not going to work. You're not going to wipe out the Israeli people and the Jewish state of Israel, and start focusing on the Gazans, because there's been no Israeli troops in Gaza since Sharon left more than 10 years ago. All right. Enough already.
All right, Mitchell.
Move on.
All right. We are going to move on. Abdul, I want to give you a chance to talk as well. What is life like in Gaza? It's such a small strip of land, but it is home to so much misery, as we saw in Noor's report, some describing it as the largest open-air prison in the world. What's your reaction to the latest fighting, and what is life like on a daily basis there?
Well, to be honest, when people talk about Gaza, they think it is, a Soviet Union, or it is China, or it is actually Russia or India. Gaza is 150 square miles only, and there are at least 2 million people caged in that part of the world, and they don't have water. They don't have electricity. The Israeli are putting imposing a sanction against Gaza. People cannot move, and the Israeli are counting calories. The male is 2,200 calories. The female is 2,000 calories. This is Gaza. No electricity. Only 3 hours electricity a day. The Israeli actually controlling this cage fully. I was born in Gaza. My family is still in Gaza. They are living a very, very dreadful situation because of this sanction. The people there, the unemployment more than 60%. The Israeli, every 3-4 years, they bomb Gaza and killing thousands and injuring thousands of people in that part of the world. And they say the Hamas is responsible. Hamas came to power in just 2007. What the Israeli used to do in Gaza before 2007, they were actually occupying Gaza, depriving people of everything. And the last war, the Israeli actually killed 260 people, including 66 children. Are those children actually Hamas fighters, for example, other things. They are talking about Hamas is killing Israelis or threatening Israelis. You know, Hamas launched at least 4,000 missiles, but they did not actually hit any Israeli housing tower at all. They did not kill any civilian in that part of the world. Why the Israeli have warplane, F-15, F-16, missiles, tanks, everything. So it is a massacre. They are committing massacres in Gaza. They are actually committing war crimes, crimes against humanity. And where are the agreements the Palestinians signed with the Israeli on the White House? The Oslo Agreement. About 28 years ago, they signed this treaty, hoping that they will have a state of themselves, a Palestinian independent state. Nothing happened at all. 28 years of negotiation, fruitless negotiation completely. And the Israeli, they did not actually take only 80% of historic Palestine because of this agreement, but also they took at least 40% of the West Bank and settling more than actually 800,000 settlers in the West Bank. This is the situation. How can you have peace with those people?
I'm sorry, we've got to cover a lot of ground here. I want to invite our other panelists into the discussion as well. Khalil, you heard Mitchell saying, you know, Hamas is to blame, and we're hearing that a lot. I went back and watched an interview with you in 2014 when the ceasefire was taking effect after the last conflict, and at that time you described the fighting this way. You said it was state-administered terror punishing the Palestinian population for the sins of a few, but don't you feel in some respects that Hamas is responsible for raining these rockets in? I mean, 12 individuals were killed in Israel. They do bear some responsibility, don't they?
Let me go back to Mitchell's word. He described the situation in Gaza and the misery imposed on the civilian population there, the 2 million that Abdel Bari just referred to in that 140 square miles. You know, he referred to it as I think a sob story, a rehash of a sob story. With all due respect, Mitchell, we have been hearing a sob story for 73 years, since 1948. Israel has made an art of sobbing throughout this. And yet it continues its policy of no peace with the Palestinian side and military aggression as the only answer. Of course, Hamas is responsible for its own act, but creation did not start on the first day of the first rocket to come out of Gaza. There was some fighting to start with before that. There were incidents in Sheikh Jarrah. There were incidents in Jerusalem. There was an invasion of Al-Haram al-Sharif in Jerusalem. And Israel was warned not to proceed with those types of measures. So Hamas was not the first shot in this battle. It was an intervention weeks after events have escalated between Israel and the Palestinians. And Hamas was the latest kind of comer, if you will, into that battle. So one could argue forever, you know, who started this and who started that. The problem is this repeated pattern of destruction leveled at the Palestinians in the absence of peace, in the absence of a solution to the Palestine problem. So the issue did not start yesterday. This is not the first wave of such confrontation between the two. And the issue is not Hamas. The issue is Palestine. It's easy to, of course, blame Hamas because then Hamas is on the terrorist list of so many countries. Then therefore, you don't have to deal with them. And you have fascists like Mitchell that come in and says, we have to bomb Shifa Hospital, the largest hospital in Gaza. Why? Because they are hiding behind, under the hospital or behind the patients, using them, as a hideout for their weapons. Every target in Israel is a hideout for some Israeli military, but that doesn't justify hitting these civilian targets. There are ways and means to resolve this problem. It is not a military problem. It's a political problem that begs for a political solution. has been begging for one since 1948.
Dan, you've been very patient. It is a political situation. There are ways and means to resolve it. You're a diplomat. What are the ways and means to resolve this conflict?
I agree with Khalil that this problem of Gaza is something that can only be solved diplomatically. There is no military solution for the Gaza crisis, and if things don't change drastically in the coming months, then in a few years' time, or even less, we'll see another round of fighting. And so, however, unlike Khalil, I do believe that the onus is on the Palestinian side. And as long as you have an entity, a terrorist entity like Hamas, which does not recognize Israel's right to exist, which continues to use terrorism and violence as a means to an end, backed by the Iranian regime, which supplies it with finances and with weapons, then it's very, very hard to engage in a real discussion, in a serious discussion. There's a new government coming into power in Israel next week, headed, combining conservative and also liberal forces, and I hope that they reevaluate the whole Israeli approach to Gaza in terms of security aspects, in terms of the continued Qatari assistance to the Gaza Strip, in terms of how to, strengthening the moderates within the Palestinian camp, meaning the Palestinian Authority and Mahmoud Abbas, rather than playing into the hands of Hamas. The recent outbreak of violence was first and foremost, an initiative of Hamas wanting to portray itself as a defender of Jerusalem. It had a lot to do with Palestinian politics and very little to do with Israel. Israel miscalculated, mishandled some aspects of the issue in Jerusalem, but the responsibility lies mostly on Hamas. As long as it runs the show on the Palestinian side, there is no hope for diplomacy, I'm afraid.
Well, let's talk about American politics, because as you know, the U.S. funnels about $3.8 billion in military aid to Israel each year. And now there's been some on Capitol Hill that are beginning to question that. Cori Bush, a member of Congress from Missouri, tweeted this: "My colleagues are rushing to give Israeli military another $1 billion to fund apartheid." She went on to say education, healthcare, and housing in our communities are underfunded. Send it to us instead. We're even hearing from Senator Bernie Sanders questioning this unconditional military aid for Israel, also expressing some sympathy for the people of Gaza. Let's listen to what he had to say.
And let us be very clear that when we talk about the tragedy that is now taking place in Gaza, what we are talking about is not only the terrible loss of life. As I hope most people know, Gaza, before this war, was an extremely poor and desperate community, and the latest Israeli bombardment has only made a bad situation much, much worse.
Dan, do you see a shift in the landscape as far as support for Israel at all?
I do see a change on the Democratic side. Definitely, the progressive side of the Democratic Party is much more critical of Israeli policies. But this didn't start yesterday. It's an ongoing process which started 5-6 years ago as relations between the Obama administration and the Netanyahu government have deteriorated. I believe, again, with a new government in Israel, there's room for improvement. There's room for an Israeli reach out to the Democratic Party, trying to repair the damage caused in previous years. But it is a concern. It is a concern because while criticizing Israel is legitimate, then there are also attacks which are very kind of spilling into anti-Semitic language, and also a very, very harsh and vile anti-Israeli approach, which does not really characterize the true spirit of the U.S.-Israel relationship. So I hope that under the new government in Israel, with the Democratic side, with the Biden administration, things can improve in the future.
Mitchell, let me ask you about concerns in Israel. Are there fears at all about these shift in sympathies on Capitol Hill, in a sense?
No, I think it's pretty safe to say that the U.S.-Israel alliance is very strong, is very solid. there is criticism now of exactly what Israel is doing. And, some of those things are just populist things. I mean, why should the U.S. fund vaccines for the rest of the world if the schools and roads in Mississippi are broken? The point is that the U.S. wants to be the global leader in foreign policy and in the world. And so that means investing in other countries and investing in places that fight terrorism. What I would say, which wasn't mentioned, is that I give the Gazan Palestinians a lot of credit. They are very, very resourceful. They are very, very creative. And even as the other guest said, with no water or electricity only 3 hours a day, they've managed to create a homemade arsenal of probably 10,000 rockets that they made. And they've been able to fire them at Israel, 4,000 of them. Very impressive. They've done damage to buildings. There have been civilian casualties as well. But here's the point. If they would take all that money that's going to be pouring in now, $500 million, United States, Qatar, other countries, and they'd start to actually try and build an economy there and actually try and create jobs and actually try and produce something positive instead of producing better ways to kill people and better ways to terrorize people. And they would stop aligning themselves with Iran, which is the major terrorist supporter in the world, and just focus on those 150 square miles and try and build up an economy and use the brain power and the resourcefulness of those people that are finding ways to build better rockets, flaming kites, all sorts of other things to kill Israelis, and use it for positive things, for trying to heal people, for trying to create things, for trying to be innovative. I think they would be a lot better off. And they would find that Israel would be an excellent partner for them and would be excellent because we have technological know-how too. And we also need workers. And we also need things that we could use the people of Gaza for. And now is a great opportunity, like Ambassador Arbell said. There's a new government coming into Israel. Unfortunately, there's not elections. 14 years, there's not elections in the Palestinian Authority. There needs to be an elected leadership there that represents the people, that the people voted for, and actually cares about the people and wants to improve things. And once you have that and you stop with the 73-year complaints, as the other guest said, even though Israel has only been in these areas since 67. So from 48 to 67, we still had the same, rhetoric and the same hate and the same killing. Enough already. Let's work on the people in Gaza, and I can guarantee you it's going to be better in the region.
Abdel, do you see a rosy scenario like he just described?
Well, actually, all of these things are lies, to be honest. Gaza is a dreadful situation. The problem is one of your guests saying that, this actually helping radicals in Gaza, and Hamas is not recognizing Israel. But okay, let us talk about Mahmoud Abbas, who recognized Israel. What happened to him? What happened to his actually Oslo agreement? Do we see independent Palestinian state? Why the American who sponsored this Oslo agreement let Gaza Strip and the West Bank to rot, actually? Why they let people to be massacred between now and then every 3 years or 4 years by the Israeli F-15 and F-16? Yes, Gaza are creative, but how can they create actually economy without petrol, without electricity, without water? Even Gaza Strip beach are polluted completely simply because the Israeli bombed the sewage treatment plant in Gaza. So imagine that. So if the Israeli always say Hamas, Hamas, Hamas. What? No, it is not actually Hamas. It is actually the Israeli themselves, the American who are helping them. They say 400 rockets. If the Israeli would like to kill people, as your guest saying, they could do it easily. The Palestinian did not actually, Hamas rocket did not destroy, demolished about 18 housing towers in Gaza. And I know personally Al-Shifa hospital in Gaza. It is actually a very, very poor hospital. There is no actually medicine. There is no enough equipment to save people. Gaza is now facing two challenges: the Israeli bombardment, the Israeli sanction, and at the top of that, Corona. Imagine that my people, my nephew, my nieces died by Corona simply because there is no treatment of Corona. There is no vaccine. There is nothing at all. So yeah, saying this is a human tragedy in Gaza. 80% of the Gazan people are living on AIDS. They have 1 meal a day, 1 meal a day only. And
Right.
they are saying that Gazan are responsible. Are we responsible for this tragedy which is taking place? Are we demolishing the human towers in Tel Aviv, in Beersheba, in Haifa, in Akron? This is the problem.
Okay,
This is the problem we are facing.
All right, we're kind of running out of time. I just have to, hold on for just a second. I just have a couple more quick questions. Khalil, the Norwegian Refugee Council says 12 of the children killed in the latest fighting were in a program to overcome trauma from previous wars, and the number of children needing psychotherapy is expected to triple. Talk to us about the invisible scars. I mean, we talk about infrastructure, we talk about tunnels, we talk about buildings, targets, but we really don't talk about the damage done to these children growing up in these kinds of environments.
Definitely, that is the human factor, if you will, or the human cost of this tragedy known as the planet of Gaza. Has been somewhat ignored in deference to discussing the strategic, the military component of these eruptions that happen from time to time. You have a whole generation of children in Gaza that has grown under this type of tension. You know, when you say there is a certain number of whatever, 12 children among the 60-plus children killed in this last wave of confrontation, actually the percentage is much higher. More than a third of Gaza's children are under some kind of treatment or another for the turmoil that they have to go through, the shock of having to live through these bombardments, the fact that the family can't even sleep in their own beds, in their own quarters. They have to stay together. The fact that some parents have exchanged with their relatives, wills, who's going to take up my children if I happen to die tonight? So these children, there are many NGOs, Palestinian NGOs and international NGOs involved in rehabilitating these children, and it's sad to see these children again and again and again going through this misery, some of them for the third or fourth time.
Dan, last word goes to you. Keep it short if you can. You talked about political solutions. There's a lot of human suffering on both sides whenever there's a war. Give me your idea of a roadmap to kind of clear up so we don't see a repeat of this in the future.
Well, first of all, the U.S. has to get more deeply involved. It can't just sit on the fence or think that the problems of the Middle East will be solved without being involved. Second, there has to be a change in how the Palestinians approach this issue. There has to be a change within Hamas. There must be also a reevaluation of policy within Israel. And there needs to be increased support, not only from the United States, but for the entire international community supporting a future process. It's not going to be solved overnight. It's going to take a long time. But there needs to be a lot of goodwill and a lot of pushing from all sides to make this happen.
Well, I want to thank all of you for joining us. A robust discussion, to say the least. Thanks so much. And that is going to do it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Mike Walter, Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for watching.